This is apropos. Well, 2 days after Israel lifted an 11-week blockade on Gaza and began allowing limited deliveries into the besieged enclave, no humanitarian supplies have yet been distributed. A UN spokesperson says the delay is due to Israeli authorities only allowing access to the territory via an insecure route where looting was likely due to the prolonged deprivation. Emerald Maxwell has the latest.
Israeli police arrest anti-war activists taking part in a protest near the Gaza border that had been officially approved in advance. Several protesters remain in detention.
These detentions are not because these people broke the law. They didn't break the law. They were arrested because they protested and are still protesting against the war.
Opposition to the war within Israel is growing louder. But retired Israeli General Yair Golan pushed the boundaries Tuesday, hitting out at the government for killing babies in a radio interview. That provoked the Prime Minister to accuse the centre-left politician of anti-Semitism and incitement against Israeli troops. Hours later, Golan attempted to fend off the criticism.
When ministers in this government celebrate the death and starvation of children, we must say so. I was referring solely to the most failed government in Israeli history, not to the IDF. Our mission is to ensure that Israel remains a sane country that does not kill children either as a hobby or as a policy.
Even opposition politicians have rushed to condemn Golan's statement, with Benny Gantz saying it was outrageous, false and extreme, and Yair Lapid calling it a gift to Israel's enemies. Recent Israeli opinion polls indicate growing skepticism about the war and increasing support for a ceasefire and hostage exchange deal. But criticism is mainly focused on the plight of the hostages or the government's motives for continuing the war, not on its toll on Palestinian civilians. But that could be beginning to change.
We've been holding signs of kids who were killed by the bombing in Gaza, and you can see a huge shift that, a majority within the Israeli society right now want an end to this war.
A Pew Research Center poll in March found that fewer Israelis support their country taking over Gaza. A third of those surveyed think Israel should occupy the enclave after the war, down from 40% last year.
Well, for more on Gaza's ever-worsening humanitarian crisis, we're joined by Rob Williams. He's CEO at the NGO War Child UK. Rob, thanks for being with us this evening. So as we've been reporting, 2 days after a trickle of aid was allowed back into Gaza, none of it has been distributed. Why is that? And just describe to us how critical the situation is there right now.
Well, first of all, on that food delivery, I checked with the team today in Gaza. They confirmed there is no indication that they've seen that any of that food and other supplies has moved from the logistics site, which is near the border, outwards. I think the UN is credible when they say that it's a very, very difficult place to move from. The situation makes this much more difficult. The aid operation is taking very, very small amounts of food, which has been brought through the wall into Gaza, and has to try and distribute that safely to a population of 2 million people who haven't received anything from the outside world since May the 3rd and are very, very malnourished and increasingly desperate. And if the Israeli policy is to only allow very small amounts of aid through into Gaza, that means that most people will not be able to access any support from this very small amount of aid that's come in. So people are going to be desperate. It's going to be potentially a very violent situation, not because of any other reason than people are literally starving to death. And the situation is desperate. It's hard to explain fully how bad the situation is in Gaza unless I tell you what my team were telling me today, which is extremely violent at the moment. There is lots of bombing. Food has gradually been running out for the last 2 months, 2.5 months now. Every day, families have tried to keep the supplies that they had going as long as they could. When the flour ran out, they started finding old bags of pasta in the back of their tent and grinding down pasta so they could turn it into bread, because bread is really the most popular food item. But now people are starving, and our team, our staff in Gaza, are also starving with them. And of course, there's a huge amount of concern for everybody in Gaza, but when you hear from your own team that they just don't have anything to eat, it adds an extra layer of concern, an understanding of how bad the situation is.
And it's even more frustrating and concerning when we know that there is so much aid that is waiting to get into Gaza. The UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency saying earlier that food for 200,000 people and medicine for 1.6 is currently sitting in a warehouse in Jordan. There's also more aid currently in Egypt. Are you hopeful at all that that is going to start moving?
There's more than enough food that could go in very, very quickly. There's a huge gap between what we're hearing from the Israeli government about their plan, which is to completely disregard the very effective aid system that's been working in Gaza and try and establish their own. And the messages we're hearing range from, we want to totally dismantle the system and rebuild it, which is just not practical, to we're going to keep the border closed and we're not going to allow any more food in at all. And that's a range of opinion which we're hearing every day. I have to be hopeful that food will be allowed in, because I can't believe that the world finds it acceptable that 2 million people are being deliberately starved to death. And I'm already seeing, and I think you're seeing it too, various governments in Europe and politicians across the world are now beginning to say something which they could have said a long time ago, which is this is not acceptable. This weapons of war should not include food. Targets of war should not include civilians. And I think we're reaching the point where we're at a critical moment. Something very serious has to happen to divert us from this route, which, unless there's a huge change in the next few days, will lead to mass starvation.
We've seen Benjamin Netanyahu again, though, coming out tonight. He seems to be intent on continuing this renewed Israeli offensive. The mounting international pressure that you refer to coming from the EU, notably, and the UK, do you think that is going to finally result in more aid actually getting through to Gaza? And how much is needed at this point when there are so many people on the brink of starvation?
I have to hope that the pressure will work, and I think we're in the foothills of what international pressure could look like. People are just beginning to talk about sanctions, and obviously there's a long way to go, and many options that people can explore to convince their Israeli colleagues that this isn't a course of action that can possibly continue. How much aid do we need? We need 500 trucks a day. And so far, in the last 2.5 months, 100 trucks have been delivered. So the gap between what's happened in the last few days, which is a tiny amount, and what needs to happen is really, really big. The only way to actually change the situation dramatically is for the doors to open and for the NGOs to be allowed to do their work. We can't unravel the system and rebuild it right away. We need a very good existing system to be allowed to operate. And it's worth saying that it is against international humanitarian law to deprive a population of food and humanitarian assistance. And we've been seeing a very deliberate policy of depriving humanitarian aid since May the 3rd. And it really has to completely change very, very quickly.
And what is your response and your organisation's response to those repeated Israeli claims that Hamas has been stealing and controlling aid, and that has necessitated this 11-week blockade?
In my opinion, and the evidence will back this up, the current aid system of delivery has been really effective at making sure that everyone who needs food aid in Gaza is receiving food aid. There have been instances of looting, where people who are desperate have taken food straight off trucks. And that's really about a security issue, that what we've created, or what has been created by Israeli government policy in Gaza is a very insecure situation. So there has been some instances of looting, but if you consider those challenges and consider what NGOs and the UN system has achieved, it's been an incredibly successful and well-controlled aid distribution.
I think we may have lost the connection there with Rob. Rob, I'm not sure if you can hear us there. We just lost the connection with you just towards the end of your last sentence there. I might just ask you though, when we're talking and looking at the current situation in Gaza, we're talking about Israeli bombardment continuing. We're talking about people, as you say, on the brink of famine, but we're also talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are once more going to be displaced by this current Israeli offensive. Where is there at this point for those people to go?
It's a huge challenge. We have members of our staff who have been told that they need to evacuate, and some of them haven't. And the reasons why they haven't are they are extremely weak. It takes a lot of energy to move yourself and your family, and they have no idea where they can go. The space which is apparently allowed for Gazans is now about 1/3 of the territory. It's incredibly crowded, and there simply aren't enough shelters in those spaces for families to move to. So a lot of families who've been told to evacuate are currently trying to find out where it is that they could possibly stay in the places where they've been told to move to. I think if they can move, they will, but there's an awful lot of people who physically can't move. It's not safe to move, and there's nowhere to move to. So I think it's not going to work to say that, well, we want civilians to move and we gave them a chance. But literally, there's hardly anywhere to move to. It's the wrong approach, and it is in breach of their humanitarian rights to expect them to move.
And Rob, just finally, in terms of the longer term approach that your organisation is going to be taking to Gaza, you know, once aid does start trickling in greater numbers, what are the challenges then going to be?
Well, they're enormous. We're a child specialist organisation, and what our main focus is about protecting children from violent and physical harm, but also to help them to get protection from psychosocial consequences. So most children in Gaza will have seen things which are likely to have produced a very traumatic response. And we have some very specialized programs that help children to recover from that kind of trauma and recover their development pathway. We would normally expect about 20% of children who've come out from a conflict zone to need that kind of psychosocial support. What we're hearing from our partners is it's 100% of children in Gaza who have a level of exposure to violence and extreme violence, which means there's a huge amount to do. So we will be focused on rebuilding a psychosocial network that can reach every child in Gaza and helping them to get back into school, because every child in Gaza needs an education so that this doesn't repeat itself in 25 years' time.
Rob, as ever, thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. That's Rob Williams, CEO at the NGO War Child UK.